Among the countless theories that seek to explain the anomalies of our recent past, one of the most persistent concerns, the very technology used to document it: early photography. The official narrative offers a simple explanation for the hauntingly empty streets of the world's great 19th century metropolises. It is, we are told, an optical illusion, a ghost in the machine created by the long exposure times of the first cameras. The equipment of the era, so the argument goes, required subjects to remain motionless for tens of minutes. The frantic energy of a city in motion, the bustling crowds, the hurried footsteps, would simply blur into nothingness, leaving behind only the stone and steel that stood still. But this convenient explanation begins to fracture under scrutiny. When we align the photographic evidence with the timeline of technological progress, by the 1880s, photographic technology had advanced to a point where it could freeze motion with remarkable clarity. This was the same era that gave birth to the first motion pictures, films that vividly captured the dynamic life of the city, the people, the carriages, the ceaseless urban flow. The claim that a clear image required a subject to be frozen for half an hour was, by then, an artifact of a bygone era. More telling, perhaps, is what is visible in these barren landscapes. In the very same photographs, we often see the distinct, clear figures of horses or a solitary pedestrian caught in a moment of stillness. This presents a glaring paradox. How could a camera, supposedly needing an exposure so long it erased thousands of people, manage to perfectly capture an animal, a creature incapable of absolute stillness, while simultaneously rendering invisible the entire population of a capital city? The sheer selectivity of this supposed technical flaw defies logic. When we set aside the comforting theory of long exposure, we are confronted with a scene of profound dissonance. We see majestic cities, monuments of grandiose architecture, with wide boulevards and complex infrastructure, all of them utterly lifeless. This is more than an absence of people. It is an absence of life itself. In sweeping panoramic views, the telltale signs of daily existence are nowhere to be found. From the thousands of chimneys etched against the sky, not a single wisp of smoke rises, as if every hearth in the city went cold at the exact same moment. There are no street vendors, no market stalls, no laundry hanging to dry in the courtyards, the ubiquitous markers of a living, breathing community. The city made their final exit. The emptiness is chillingly familiar, echoing Maud Monument to a life that was abruptly evacuated. The magnificent buildings are cold, monumental shells. And then there is one final, unsettling detail. Against the backdrop of these structures, which we are told are ancient and established, the vegetation tells a different story. We see only thin, young saplings, trees whose age appears to be no more than a few years. The photograph, a device created to capture and preserve reality, instead presents us with a profound enigma. It forces us to question not only the technology, but the history it purports to represent. What we are left with is not a record of a world teeming with life, but a silent testament to a world that was, or perhaps, a world that was meticulously prepared for a life yet to arrive. Where are the ancient trees that should have stood in these old cities? An impression takes hold that all vegetation was annihilated, that nature had only just begun its slow reclamation of a civilization's ruins. Our perception blocks the obvious, because from our earliest years, we are conditioned to trust only in authority, in the official source. The systems of education and the scientific institutions are constructed in such a way that any deviation from the approved chronology is perceived as absurdity. The titles, the medals, the awards held by experts are treated as guarantees of truth, though history knows countless examples where universally accepted facts were revealed to be delusions. It is easier for us to believe in the technical limitations of old cameras than to entertain the thought that these photographs captured an unvarnished reality. Empty cities, abandoned by an unknown civilization, inhabited, for some reason, by almost no one. Thus, the argument of long exposure times serves only as a screen, hiding an inconvenient truth. If these cities were not populated by the builders of these structures, then who erected them? How is it that the few people captured in the frame appear as alien elements against a backdrop of cyclopean architecture, creations that so clearly surpass their own technological means? The answers compel us to reconsider not only the history of photography, but the history of technology itself. The discrepancy between the complexity of the architecture and the primitive tools available to our official ancestors becomes ever more apparent. The silence that shrouds the urban landscapes of the 19th century evokes not just bewilderment, but an instinctive anxiety, akin to what visitors feel in modern exclusion zones. If one carefully analyzes the atmosphere of these places, it becomes clear we are not witnessing quiet weekend mornings, but the aftermath of a total exodus or a global cleansing. It is a phenomenon that could be called the Pripyat Syndrome. The set dressings of civilization remain untouched. Majestic stone shells stand in their places, but the soul of the city, its biological life, has vanished. The most glaring sign of this lifelessness is found on the rooftops, the smokestacks. In an age before electric and gas heating as we know it, the life of any large settlement depended directly on its hearths and furnaces. Hundreds of thousands of chimneys across densely built cities should have been belching plumes of smoke around the clock, especially in the cold months, to heat the enormous halls and living quarters. An industrial city of that era, by definition, could not be transparent. It should have been shrouded in smog and soot. And yet, what we are shown are crystal clear horizons. The chimneys are cold, dormant, as if these vast residential and municipal structures were never truly alive. They stand not as homes, but as monuments to an echo, their silence a testament to a story we have been forbidden to hear. The structures stand as if mothballed, severed from the very systems that would sustain life. This is not the quiet of a temporary pause. It is the profound silence of a world devoid of inhabitants, a world with no need for warmth. As our view descends from the rooftops to the cobblestones below, we are confronted by an inexplicable sterility. The historical chronicles paint a vivid picture of these cities, teeming anthills of humanity, overflowing with chaos, noise, and the grime of daily life. Commerce was meant to spill from every corner, from stalls, from carts, from blankets laid upon the ground. Narrow alleys should be festooned with drying laundry, the constant signature of a world without modern convenience. The ground itself should bear the marks of thousands of people and their animals, refuse, straw, discarded goods, and barrels. Yet there is nothing. The avenues are either swept to an unnatural gleam, or they are buried under a strange, ownerless soil, a landscape devoid of the immediate signs of active life. There are no merchants, no customers, none of the vital, chaotic energy of a living metropolis. The city appears as a stage, meticulously prepared for a population that has not yet arrived, or perhaps one that has just fled in a great hurry, taking with them every last vestige of their presence. But it is the vegetation that presents the most startling anomaly, a profound dissonance with the architecture. Beside edifices that official history dates back centuries, we find only thin, fragile saplings. The trees lining the great boulevards and parks are mere adolescents, their trunks slender, their canopies barely formed. Had these cities grown organically over centuries, we would expect to see mighty ancient oaks and sycamores, their roots reaching deep into the soil of history itself. Their absence speaks of a cataclysm. It suggests the topsoil was scoured away or entirely replaced in the very recent past. The landscape appears to have been reset. The old flora vanished along with the old populace, and nature is only now beginning its timid reclamation of the land, a delicate green against a backdrop of cyclopean stone. When compared with modern images of abandoned territories, the sense of déjà vu is inescapable. The city of Pripyat, frozen in time, echoes this same emptiness. The vacant eyes of its windows, the overgrown courtyards, the suffocating silence. The only difference is that we acknowledge one as a ruin, while we are told the other was a thriving center of civilization at the very moment the photograph was taken. This substitution of reality for narrative becomes clear the moment one stops listening to the accepted interpretation and simply trusts what one sees. Before us is a world reeling from an event, a silent, unnamed catastrophe that halted the normal course of history. Yet the most jarring element in these scenes is not the emptiness itself. It is the staggering contrast between the scale of the architecture and the few human figures scattered within it. Solitary wanderers and primitive horse-drawn carts appear dwarfed and utterly out of place, set against grandiose cathedrals, sweeping palaces, and endless colonnades of impossible geometry. These are not the builders of this world. They appear as scavengers, or perhaps are a postscript to a story whose main text has been erased, leaving us to question not only who built these cities, but where they all went. A question emerges, one that threatens to shatter the very foundations of our accepted history. Could a people, armed with little more than shovels, picks, and wooden carts, truly have engineered and erected architectural wonders of such breathtaking perfection? A technical chasm opens between the complexity of these ancient structures and the primitive tools we are told were used to build them. It is a gap so vast, it forces us to question not just the methods, but the very possibility of their creation. The official chronicle of human progress is a simple, linear ascent, a slow, deliberate climb from rudimentary hand tools to the power of steam, and eventually to the age of electricity and intricate mechanics. We are taught that the first handheld electric tool was not invented until the twilight of the 19th century, and did not become common until the middle of the 20th. This timeline dictates that every colossal monument of the 18th and 19th centuries was raised by the sheer force of muscle, guided by chisels, hammers, and the simplest of levers. But when this narrative is held against the stone and steel of what was actually built, the story begins to unravel. An impassable gulf separates the acknowledged abilities of our ancestors from the monumental legacy they left behind. Nowhere is this technological paradox more starkly illustrated than in the story of the Erie Canal in North America. Official records insist that this mammoth waterway, stretching 585 kilometers, 12 meters wide, and 4 meters deep, was carved from the earth in a mere 8 years, between 1817 and 1825. We are asked to accept that in an era when the United States, by the admission of its own historians, had not a single professional engineer, a band of immigrant laborers achieved an engineering feat that would challenge even modern builders. Their task was not merely to dig through soft soil. They had to fell dense, virgin forests, construct labyrinthine systems of locks and aqueducts, and conquer the Niagara Escarpment, a formidable wall of solid limestone. A simple mathematical analysis reveals an impossible truth. To complete the project on schedule, workers would have needed to excavate and finish an average of 1.5 kilometers of the canal every 8 days. This pace allows for no weekends, no rest, no pause for the brutal winter cold. All of this in a time before the invention of dynamite, when the only explosive available was volatile, inefficient black powder. Such a rate of progress, using only shovels and wheelbarrows, is not just improbable, it is a theoretical impossibility. This leads to a startling hypothesis, that the so-called builders were not creating a waterway from nothing, but were instead clearing and restoring a far more ancient transportation artery. A relic, perhaps, of a civilization far more advanced than our own. Similar questions echo in the stonework of the era. Across the globe, we find buildings clad in granite blocks weighing many tons, shaped and fitted with a precision that seems to defy the tools of the age. We are left staring at the evidence, forced to consider that the history we have been taught may only be a surface layer, beneath which lies a deeper, more complex, and far more astonishing truth. In the ancient world, stone was set against stone with a join so perfect a knife's blade cannot find purchase. Columns carved from a single block of granite possess the flawless geometry of a body in rotation, a symmetry impossible to achieve by hand. To sculpt such forms, one requires industrial-scale lathes and hardened tools capable of slicing through granite as if it were clay. The official narrative insists that artisans spent decades patiently polishing the stone with nothing more than sand and water. But when we consider the sheer volume of these structures, in St. Petersburg or Paris alone, a stark reality emerges. To build them by hand would have demanded a population many times greater than what existed, and a timeline measured not in years, but in centuries. An even greater enigma lies scattered across every continent. The star forts. Their intricate crystalline shapes possess a perfect symmetry, a fractal beauty that can only be truly appreciated from a great height. We are told these bastions were engineered for an age of cannon fire, their angled walls designed to ricochet incoming projectiles. And yet, the sheer complexity of their design seems excessive for simple fortification. It defies logic to construct such sophisticated figures, requiring geodetic calculations of incredible precision merely to serve as a target. How could the architects of the past even mark out these colossal patterns on the land without ever seeing them from the air? The exactitude of these objects suggests their purpose was not rooted in the art of war, but perhaps in something else entirely. A science of energy or wave processes of which we now know nothing. These disparate facts, the impossible masonry, the geometry of the star forts, point toward a disquieting conclusion, that we are a species with amnesia. We lay claim to achievements built with technologies we no longer comprehend. The people of the 19th century, captured in old photographs on horseback, appear not as builders, but as inns of a world far more advanced than their own, turning palaces into stables, power stations into temples, and inventing legends of how their ancestors built it all with a chisel and a prayer. If a civilization capable of such wonders once existed, where did it vanish? Why was its knowledge lost, its great cities left to decay? The answer, it seems, is literally beneath our feet, hidden in the layers of earth we have been taught to ignore. Walk through the historic center of any old city, whether in Europe, Russia, or the Americas. An attentive eye will inevitably notice an architectural anomaly, what official science dismisses with the benign term cultural layer. We are told that over centuries, the ground level rises from an accumulation of dust, debris, and pavement. But this simple explanation fails to account for the truth hidden in plain sight. Entire ground floors of colossal buildings, buried deep in the earth, their grand entrances now basement windows. The past is not merely a different time, it is a different place, a foundation upon which our own world is unknowingly built. One need only look to the foundations of our oldest cities to see a theory begin to unravel. An unsettling question, etched in stone and brick, hiding in plain sight. We see windows fully formed, half drowned in earth. They are not bricked over. Often their glass remains intact, staring out at nothing but the dark soil of a basement wall, or pressed directly against the paving stones of a modern sidewalk. A logical paradox presents itself. What architect, in their right mind, would design a window to be built below the level of the ground? The sole purpose of such an opening is to admit sunlight and fresh air. To place it in the earth, only to then construct special light wells or simply entomb it, is the height of engineering absurdity. And it is not merely windows. Deeper still, we find entire doorways, grand arched portals and formal entrances that now lead nowhere, terminating abruptly in a dense wall of compacted soil. When modern repair work or the laying of new utilities requires the removal of asphalt from the walls of these buildings, a revelation occurs. Whole floors are exposed, levels whose existence no one had suspected. These are not cellars or technical spaces. They are former first floors, built with high aesthetic detail, which, for some unknown reason, now lie buried beneath 2, 3, and sometimes even more meters of earth. The official explanation, a gradual accumulation of the cultural layer, cannot withstand scrutiny. To accumulate 3 meters of soil by natural means requires thousands of years, not a mere 2 centuries. Furthermore, had the street level risen slowly, over generations, building owners would have adapted. They would have raised their entrances and modified their windows, not simply allowed mud and refuse to seal off their sources of light. What we sudden catastrophe, an event tied to a colossal displacement of Earth, or a fundamental change in the structure of the soil itself. Geologists and researchers point to the phenomenon of soil liquefaction, which occurs during powerful earthquakes or vibrational forces on a planetary scale. In such moments, solid ground temporarily takes on the properties of a liquid. Heavy stone structures do not topple, they simply sink, settling into the earth while retaining their structural integrity, but losing their height. Such processes have been observed in our own time, during earthquakes in Japan and New Zealand, where entire buildings were seen descending into the ground, remaining perfectly vertical. If we extrapolate this phenomenon to a global scale, the strange cityscapes of the 19th century begin to make a terrifying kind of sense. In old engravings and early photographs from that period, we often see not just muddy streets, but veritable mountains of earth piled against the facades of palaces and cathedrals. The people in these images, armed with shovels and wheelbarrows, are not engaged in construction, as is commonly believed. They are engaged in reclamation. They are digging out the structures that survived, attempting to bring a buried world back to life. It is a silent testament, suggesting the world we inhabit is built upon another, a history not written in books, but submerged beneath our feet, waiting for us to recognize that we have been walking on the rooftops of a forgotten age all along. Makeshift wooden causeways, thrown across a sea of mud. Windows on the second story, now serving as front doors to the first. The sheer global scale of the phenomenon is staggering. From London to Moscow, from New York to Melbourne, the same inexplicable picture emerges. Magnificent architecture, whether antique or colonial, has its foundations, its entire lower floors, swallowed by a thick mantle of clay and sediment. This is not the mark of a local flood. It is evidence of a planetary catastrophe, an event some have called the Great Mud Flood or the Great Burial. A disaster of such magnitude, it reshaped the landscapes of entire continents. The very ground level of the world, it seems, rose up, burying the history of a prior age beneath it.
To accept the reality of such a cataclysm is to arrive at a terrifying conclusion.
If entire cities were buried several meters deep in a short span of time, the event must have entailed a colossal loss of human life. The tide of earth that consumed the ground floors would have left no chance for those caught below, obliterating the familiar systems of life support. The few who survived would have faced starvation, exposure, and the total collapse of their infrastructure. And here, the fragmented pieces of a forgotten history begin to align. The eerily empty cities, captured in early photographs, were not an artistic choice by the photographer. They were the direct aftermath of the disaster. The population had been virtually annihilated. But the cities did not remain empty forever. Soon after the event, new inhabitants appeared. Their origin raises even more questions than the buried windows. Who were these people who settled the ruins of a great civilization? And from where did they arrive in such numbers, if the entire world lay in ruins?
If we accept the hypothesis of a global cataclysm that buried cities and destroyed the vast majority of the adult population, we are confronted with a chilling demographic question. Who filled these desolate metropolises just a few decades later? On the cusp of the 19th and 20th centuries, we witness an explosive growth of population in major industrial centers. But the structure of this new society appears profoundly unnatural. It is not the organic recovery of generations, but some employ a new workforce. The key to this enigma may lie hidden in plain sight, in one of the most common and yet overlooked themes of that era, the phenomenon of the mass orphan. The cultural code of the 19th century is saturated with the image of the parentless child. The classic literature we have come to accept as fiction may, in fact, serve as documentary evidence of the age. Oliver Twist, Jane Eyre. The characters of Hugo and Dostoevsky. They are all orphans. This was not merely a popular plot device to evoke pity in the reader. It was the reflection of a horrifying reality that had become the new normal. A society was overflowing with children who knew no lineage, a generation severed from its roots and deprived of family memory. It was this generation, a people without a past, that became the foundation for a new world built upon the ruins of the old. They were perfectly suited for the role. They had no grandparents to tell them the truth of what had happened to the world, of who had built the majestic edifices, or how people had lived before the cataclysm. Their history began on a blank page, inside an institutional home, under the watchful eye of the state. The statistics of the era, when viewed through this lens, are staggering. In London, Paris, Moscow, New York, and other major cities, gargantuan foundling homes and asylums began to open, their scale rivaling that of industrial factories. These were not cozy havens of mercy, but veritable conveyor belts for the intake and processing of human material. In Moscow alone, the city's foundling hospital received tens of thousands of infants annually. In New York and London, the figures were comparable. From where did this colossal number of children appear, in cities that had only recently seemed desolate? The official narrative points to poverty, low morality, and high birth rates. But these factors alone cannot explain the sudden emergence of hundreds of thousands of abandoned infants, appearing almost simultaneously in every corner of the globe. It has the appearance of a centralized, coordinated harvest of a new human population. Moreover, the legal framework of the time seems to have been deliberately re-engineered to dissolve the traditional family and alienate children. Harsh poor laws were enacted, making it impossible for a single mother or an impoverished family to keep a child. Social norms branded unwed mothers, compelling them to surrender their newborns to state institutions to escape starvation and public condemnation. An entire industry of baby farming and secret births arose, where infants were taken away moments after their first breath. One is left with the impression that a state machine was methodically severing the bond between parent and child, seeking absolute control over the upbringing of a new generation. Children became the property of the system, a resource to be moved, trained in necessary skills, and used at its discretion. These vast armies of orphans, dressed in identical uniforms, lingen of industrialization. It was their small hands that tended the machines in the factories. It was they who cleaned the very chimneys that had suddenly begun to smoke again over the cities. And it was they who became the new inhabitants of the empty apartments with their dust-filled windows. But the most chilling aspect of this story is not the conditions in which they were kept, but the logistics of their distribution. The concentration of children in the megacities was only the first stage. A far grander, more unsettling design was about to unfold. For when you engineer a people without a memory, you can send them anywhere and tell them anything. You can build a future, but it is a future that rests upon a foundation of ghosts. A need arose to transfer this living resource across immense distances, to populate empty lands on other continents. The scale of this operation, this movement of children, defies comprehension. This was no chaotic flight of refugees. It was a meticulously organized logistical network, operating with a chilling efficiency. Here, we approach one of the darkest and least known chapters in the story of humanity's Great Reset, where the fates of hundreds of thousands of children were decided by the stroke of a pen. Their pasts were methodically erased. They were assigned new names, loaded into rail cars, and dispatched into the unknown. Thus began the era of the orphan trains, and of strange cultivation technology generation. The logistics of resettling a depopulated world required not only the concentration of human resources in orphanages, but their redistribution across vast, vacant territories. It is here that history reveals one of its most ambitious and unsettling chapters. Official historiography attempts to frame the orphan trains as a noble act of mercy, but a closer examination reveals a cold, calculated transport operation for the delivery of a workforce. Beginning in the mid-19th century and continuing until the 1930s, trains packed to capacity with children departed regularly from the teeming east coast of the United States, bound for the continental interior, the Great Midwest. The process of their distribution at each station bore less resemblance to adoption and more to a livestock fair, or an auction. Children were lined up on station platforms or in local meeting halls where farmers and townspeople would inspect them, checking their teeth and muscle. Brothers and sisters were ruthlessly separated. Sturdy boys were taken for the hard labor of the fields, girls for domestic service. Those who appeared weak or ill were sent onward to the next station, and the next, until someone, anyone, was willing to take them. It was a mass deportation of minors, stripped of their past, their surnames, and their kin. This process was not limited to America. Similar programs operated throughout the British Empire, where more than 100,000 children were forcibly exported to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Vast territories, home to those same empty cities of antique architecture, were in need of a population. The empire supplied it with its most powerless subjects, its children. And yet, If the orphan trains can be rationalized as a brutal consequence of social upheaval, the phenomenon of amusement park incubators is a discovery that shocks and confounds any researcher. In the early 20th century, at a time when official medicine was supposedly taking its first tentative steps in neonatology, a different and far more public technology was on display. The line between preservation and production, between care and cultivation, begins to blur, suggesting that the engineering of a new populace was a project far stranger and more deliberate than we have ever been told. At the turn of the 20th century, amidst the clamor of world's fairs and the glittering lights of amusement parks, a new and curious attraction began to appear. High-tech pavilions showcasing living, human infants. The most famous operator of these shows was a man named Martin Cooney, a figure with no confirmed medical degree, who transformed the care of premature babies into a public spectacle. For the price of a ticket, crowds would gather to gaze upon the most fragile of lives. Tiny infants, lying in gleaming glance, claim that some 80,000 infants passed through Cooney's incubators alone. The figure is staggering. In an era of far lower population density, it begs a fundamental question. Where did such a vast number of premature children, all in need of artificial life support, come from? And more importantly, where were their parents? The conventional narrative tells of desperate mothers turned away by ill-equipped hospitals, bringing their children to the fairgrounds as a last resort. But it is difficult to accept that thousands of women would willingly surrender their newborns to a carnival sideshow to be put on display for the amusement of the masses. The very terminology is unsettling. The word incubator, borrowed directly from poultry farming, implies artificial hatching, not merely life-saving intervention. When viewed alongside the sheer volume of children, many of unknown origin, a more disturbing possibility begins to surface. What if these facilities were not saving foundlings, but were instead part of a technological process, a final stage of maturation, or perhaps even cultivation? It is no coincidence that these infant exhibits often stood in the shadow of pavilions dedicated to eugenics, the then popular science of improving the human race. At these same fairs, Better Baby contests were held, where children were evaluated on their. The pieces assemble into a single cohesive picture, a global project to create a new kind of human. An older population, one that remembered a previous epoch, had vanished, perhaps wiped away by a great, unrecorded cataclysm. In its place, a new generation was seeded, born of incubators and distributed by orphan trains. These were a people without roots, without ancestral memory, standardized and ready to accept any history written for them in the textbooks of a new world. The link between the silent, empty cities with their mysteriously buried first floors and the sudden appearance of immense masses of parentless children seems unmistakable. They are not separate events, but links in a single logistical chain designed to repopulate a cleansed planet. New people were distributed into prepared but empty stage sets. They were given new names and taught to live in a world they did not build. This very generation of orphans would become our great-grandparents, passing down to us the version of reality created for them by the architects of a great reset. As the scattered fragments of this mosaic click into place, they form a map of a world far different from the one we know. They compel us to ask not only who we are, but what we are. The inheritors of a manufactured past, living out a script whose true authors remain forever in the shadows. From a land of silence, seen only in faded photographs, a world of buried first floors entombed in clay, and the sudden appearance of millions of children, seemingly from nowhere,
we arrive at a frightening yet unavoidable synthesis.
The narrative of continuous, linear development, the one etched into us by schoolhouse textbooks, is a comforting fiction. In truth, we exist in a world after the end of a world, the inheritors of a civilization we did not build and cannot comprehend. Humanity today resembles nothing so much as squatters in a derelict mansion. We have no understanding of how its life support systems function, who raised its colossal walls, or where its former masters have gone. We have learned only to paint the facades, to run crude wires over ancient, ornate plasterwork, and to call the architectural masterpieces of another age our own. A chain of events emerges, a sequence so logical it becomes impossible to ignore. First, a global cataclysm, an event accompanied by a mass displacement of Earth, inundating cities with tides of mud and reshaping the very landscape of the planet. This event, which we might call the Great Flood or the Great Mud, erased the adult population from the face of the Earth, the keepers of knowledge, the masters of technology. The great cities sank into silence and desolation, their lower levels buried beneath meters of dense, suffocating clay. Then, after a short time, new curators of this reality stepped onto the stage. They organized the collection and redistribution of the surviving, or perhaps artificially cultivated, biological resource: children. Deprived of ancestral memory, raised in state-run homes and incubators, these new people became the perfect material from which to build a new society on a blank slate. They were handed a fabricated history. The construction of monolithic palaces was attributed to men with hammers and chisels. They were convinced they were the pinnacle of evolution. But why construct such a monumental falsehood? Why did the authorities of all nations so stubbornly conceal a catastrophe from the recent past? The answer leads us beyond the confines of history and into the very structure of the cosmos. For if we have been deceived about time, it follows that we have been deceived about space. The concealment of our true chronology is essential to prevent us from asking questions about the nature of our habitat. The previous civilization, it would seem, understood perfectly where it was. Their architecture, oriented to the cardinal points, their star forts and cathedrals functioning as resonators, all speak to a profound knowledge of physics and etheric technologies impossible in a chaotic universe born of a random explosion. Here, we approach the greatest barrier to perception. Official science paints a picture of an infinite cosmos, where Earth is a tiny sphere hurtling through a vacuum at immense speed. This heliocentric model is perfectly suited to making evolution. But if the catastrophe was not a natural event, then the world we inhabit is not an accident. It is a design. And the architect trucked far more deliberate and far more confining than we could ever dare to imagine. What if catastrophe is not a random act of nature, but a systemic reboot? If our world is not a spinning globe in a limitless cosmos, but a stationary plane, sealed beneath a protective dome, everything changes. In such a world, history is no longer a chronicle of human endeavor, but a managed process. Disaster becomes the press of a button, a reset initiated by the silent controllers of this vast terrarium. The link between a falsified history and the true shape of our world is unbreakable. To acknowledge the existence of a highly advanced civilization before our own is to admit they knew the truth of the celestial vault above and the finite borders of our realm. Those who rewrote the books, who engineered a new science in the aftermath of the last cataclysm, did everything in their power to lock our consciousness within the prison of infinite space.
They gave us a globe so we would stop searching for the edges. They gave us a theory of evolution so we would stop searching for our creators. We exist in an artificial, constructed reality. The stage props are genuine, but the script is a lie. The awareness of this fact is agonizing. It shatters the very foundation upon which the modern identity is built. It is a difficult truth to accept, that your ancestors were not great conquerors and builders, but orphans, brought in by the trainload to inhabit the ruins of another's world. Yet, it is this very understanding that offers freedom. The moment you see the cracks in the official version of history, you begin to notice them in the physical picture of the world as well. The mud that buried entire cities did not just hide the first floors of ancient buildings, it hid the truth that our world is an artificial construct, a complex mechanism that is periodically restarted. We are merely the latest shift of inhabitants, faced with a choice. We can awaken and finally see the lattice of the dome over our heads, or we can continue to sleep, cradled by the fairy tales in textbooks, until the time comes for the next great cleansing.